Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today. Very excited that you could join us live. And for those of you who are going to be watching us in the future, we are offering our welcome to you as well. My name is Lydia Garcia, and I am the Denver Center for the Performing Arts Executive Director of Equity and Organization Culture, as well as the very lucky moderator of today's conversation. I am excited to introduce our panel of theatrical luminaries and to get started with the conversation. But first, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of the inspiration for our gathering today. So as you might know, Colorado is the first stop on an international tour of CARNE y ARENA, which is an Academy Award-winning virtual reality installation from acclaimed director Alejandro G. Iñárritu. This VR experience explores the human condition of immigrants and refugees, and is based on true accounts of crossing the border between Mexico and the United States, oftentimes featuring the stories of folks who lived it. Carne y Arena is produced by Fee Studio, Legendary Entertainment, and the Emerson Collective in association with DCPA's Off Center. For more information, we invite you to go to denvercenter.org to get more details about the performance. And today's conversation is actually one of a series of free virtual programs and community conversations that is being offered by cultural organizations during the run of Carne y Arena. So we encourage you to check those out as well. But today, I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by three of the country's most produced Latinx playwrights who are mentors and inspirations for me as well, who will be sharing their own experiences with telling Latinx-centered stories and discussing the opportunities and challenges of sharing stories of trauma like Carne y Arena. Their names and faces will be likely quite familiar to Denver Center audiences and to Colorado audiences because you know their work and you've loved their work. So joining us today in a moment will be Karen Zacarías, whose native gardens, just like us, and Mariella in the desert have graced DCPA stages. I'll share that Karen has the distinction of being only the third playwright to have a play produced in each of our three theaters at the DCPA. And spoiler alert, the other two just happen to be William Shakespeare and August Wilson. So Karen is in very good company. Also joining us today, José Cruz González, the author of American Mariachi, Sunsets and Margaritas, and September Shoes, as well as Luis Alfaro, whose Mojada was slated to be in our 2021 season, and hopefully, will be something that we can enjoy in the future. But also whose Greek trilogy was recently recorded and is being shared on national broadcast, which is very, very exciting, and hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit more about that. In addition, Jose and Luis are current commissioned playwrights, and Karen was commissioned for her beloved play, Just Like Us. So without further ado, let me have them join us onto the virtual stage so we can welcome them and have them introduce themselves. Hi, everybody.
Hey!
Hi.
Good morning.
So happy to see your faces, friends. So we'd love it if each of you, could, first of all, tell us your name, where you're joining us from today, how you would self-identify as a theater maker, as a teatrista, and if there's anything else that you'd like to share that might be bringing you joy today. So Karen, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Karen Zacarías, and I am tuning in from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and I am here with my three children and my snoring dog, and very excited to be part of this conversation. I have been fans of Luis Alfaro and José Cruz González's work forever. They will even tell you when I ran up and fangirled them in different occasions. But both of them related to the Kennedy Center. And Lydia, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today, to see you navigating and curating these important conversations. So thank you. Hi, gentlemen.
Hey.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry about my ears. My daughters let me borrow this. I have no other technical stuff. So anyway.
They are perfect. Oh my God. Luis, do you want to go next?
Sure. Good morning.
Uh-oh.
Koreatown, where I say my tagline is "Every day is midnight in Koreatown." That's why I look this way. I am so pleased to be here. I'm a Chicano playwright. That's the way I self-identify, and I work mostly in, I would say, plays, poetry, and some performance art. And it's great to be here with this family because, yes, it is a family. We've been together for many, many years. So I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm José Cruz González, and just want to say what an honor to be here with these amazing folks and back at Denver, so where my heart's at. I also want to send love to all our friends and colleagues and their students across the country, and can't wait to get back into the theater with you and to tell stories. Chicano writer, and I'm talking with you from the Central Coast of California. Nopomo is the place where I live now.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Welcome, and really excited, for this conversation. Not only because as always, I think stories and storytelling and storytellers always feel urgent and timely, no matter what moment we happen to find ourselves in. And especially when we're in a national and international moment where the thing that we most crave, right, connection, to be together, to share stories, in many ways is the thing that we're being denied, right? And so how we're being innovative and staying connected to each other just feels urgent and necessary. So right off the bat, I'm sure that there is a question, even in the framing of this conversation, right? The title, putting Latinx story center stage, and the question of, what is the language and the terminology that we're using? What in the world does Latinx mean, right? And it makes me think that actually right now we're in a moment where folks, we're in the headlines, right, of in this post-election moment where once again we are deconstructing the Latino vote, the Latino community. What is this new term Latinx, and how is it used? Who does it apply to? I thought I'd actually start us off with talking about the language, right, that we use, and just to give the folks who are listening, just a little bit of historical context. If you don't know, I am also a dramaturg, which means that history and context is always of appeal to me. But that question of what does it mean to be Latino? What does it mean to be Latina? What does it mean to be Latinx in a country where it seems like we have been emerging almost on cue every 5, 10, 20 years, where, headlines like, I think in 2016, it was Fox News that said that the 2016 election was going to be determined by the Latino community. And this time we mean it. And yet, we can go back and see, headlines like that, like clockwork since the 1890s have been talking about the Latin explosion, right? Have been talking about the self-definition and self-empowerment of Latino communities. And in this time, we're coming into our own, right? And yet, we've always been here, and we're not newly important. We've always been important, right? And so that question of, what does it mean to be Latino, where, terms like Latino and Hispanic, were often created as markers by the U.S. government, right? And especially with the U.S. Census Bureau, to try and define who we are, right? And under an umbrella term like Latino, Latina, and Latinx, which is a new addition to the vocabulary, right? Trying to create something that is even more expansive of gender identity, that is not tied to male or female, that allows breadth and space for, for gender non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals, or us as a community, as a multi-gender community. Where in one term, we're trying to encompass dozens of different countries and national identities, and hundreds of different ethnic identities and ethnic markers. So What's the definition of Latino, Latina, Latinx that you have found has really resonated with your lived experience, or how you see yourself navigating, community? By way of offering, the one that I often go to, which is a lovely definition that someone shared with me once, was that Latinos are the peoples born of contact, which to me really spoke to, just like how much of world migration has come through the countries that we now call part of Latin America, right? From the indigenous Americans to, white European settlers to enslaved African peoples, folks who have sought refuge, from the Middle East and North Africa, merchants from Asia, or explorers from the Pacific Ocean islands, right? So what's the definition that really speaks to you? And I don't know if someone wants to start us off.
Well, let me just say that's a big landscape there, and to say that actually a couple of years ago did my DNA, just wanted to see what am I made up of, and it was interesting to find out about 49% of me is indigenous, right? But then I've got the Iberian connection to Spain, right? But then there's some Jewish in there, and then there's African in there, and then there's some English in there. And so I'm all those things, if that makes sense in my DNA. But in terms of who I am, I grew up in the Southwest. I identified, and these terms have changed over the years in my lifetime. From being, ¿qué soy yo? Eres Mexicano. Oh, okay. But then, no, you're Mexican American with somebody else. Oh, no, you're Chicano. No, you're Hispanic. No, you're Latino. Now you're Latinx. So those terms have changed as we've moved forward in time. And so I'm all those things.
Yeah, I would say specificity seems to be very important to me. I'm Chicano first, right? Because I'm always trying to connect with the deepest part of myself, the most spiritual part of myself, which to me is that politicized Mexican-American part of myself. But I grew up in a Mexican household with a Mexican father. So, we were Mexican until I became Chicano. And then those terms sort of expand out as needed, I would say. So for me, I'm very clear to make sure that people understand that I'm a queer Chicano. So Latinx is a very important word. It's a word that starts to allow everybody who's been there in, right? So some people have a problem with its historical context, maybe a little bit, but I think what's important here is sometimes it's important for me to be Latinx. It's important to me to be in the room where more people can express themselves in the way they want to. So because I teach, most of my students refer to themselves as Latinx. They refer to themselves in that incredible middle binary somewhere, right? The they, them, their. So I'm happy to embrace that. I'm happy to explore that because it doesn't take away from my being Chicano, but it does help me understand how, especially in a city like Los Angeles, right, where we're the majority population, I'm able to embrace also the Central American community that I live inside of. So it just allows me to really allow people to define themselves as they see fit. But I think, I'm of the generation that Chicano is the most important word for me because it's the word where I went from being a Mexican to a Mexican American to being my own self, to being my own political self.
I love that.
Yeah, and for me, I was born in Mexico. I just became a U.S. citizen not too long ago. So for me, it was like as I came to the United States and I would tell people that I was Mexican, and people would be like, "Oh, what does that mean? Do you have a donkey? What is all of that?" And for me, it was and as different, which is different for a lot of the people. My father would not let us speak English at home. He was like, "You will not lose your Spanish. Tienen que hablar español." And my sister and I would sneak in English, on the sidelines, whatever. But like the dinner table, all of that. So it was different than earlier generations where there was a sense of shame of not speaking English, et cetera. On the contrary, my father was somos mexicanos, you know that kind. So we have to speak Spanish, and you need to know your history and all of that. And then it's gotten, I guess, in some ways, I am not just this Mexicana. I am now I think a Latinx person, which is this more encompassive. I'm not from this one little town in Cuernavaca, Morelos anymore. I'm from this expansive breadth of tapestry that includes Salvadoreños, Venezolanos, Brazilians. You know, that I like the thing about Latinx is that it's not just Hispanic, isn't connected to language. It's connected to a shared cultural, and yes, it's also a colonizing part, but we have to recognize that power there. So I've enjoyed being part of I didn't like being Hispanic as much as I like being Latina, and I like being Latinx even more. And now there's the talk about Latin, which I have to be honest, kept up with, because I've been in pandemic, what have you. And there's a big discussion that Latinx, it feels very academic and people want to be, I am very much of the school, if this is what you want to be called, I will honor that. And I will call you what you want to be called, especially as someone who people always question me, no matter what room I was, like, oh, but are you really this? Oh, are you really that? And I was like, yes, so I just take people at their worth. So the bigger the family, the better, I think. And then all of us can give everybody, I mean, it's the same thing with being a writer, right? What makes all of us, we're all right about a lot of the same themes. But our unique point of view, where we were born, who we brought up with, what we ate as a child, is what colors our writing and who we are. And so honoring both things, I really believe in this idea that you can do more than one thing at once. So, yeah.
Interesting. Like our art can be as complicated as our lives are, right? And the language can be created to reflect that. Absolutely. So, I do want to note that, it's great to see comments and questions already coming up, through our various platforms. So if you are with us live, please join us in the conversation. And if you have questions, we're hoping to have time at the end of our time together where, we would love to hear from you. So, yes, absolutely. Keep up the conversation. Join us. So, Karen, I think in many ways you have, I think, naturally transitioned us to my next question, because like the name of our event today talks about Latinx stories, and immediately my dramaturg's brain says, well, what is that? Right. And, how are we defining a Latino, Latina, Latinx story? And as always, I want to say, like, well, what is it, that makes it Latino or Latina or Latinx? Is it the identity of its writer, right? So is it like the presence of one of you? Is it the characters that you channel through your play, or the setting? Like is it about the regional identity that you're depicting? Is it about the language, right? Or about the dialect? Where we know that sometimes we have a very complicated relationship, right, between our families' trajectories and, Karen, as you just named, like also colonizing languages, right? Is it about the narrative conventions that you use? Is it about the themes that you're exploring? Is it about the politics? Is a Latino story always inherently political? So, so in your experience, or, in your vision, what does Latino, Latina, Latinx theater look like? Like what, how do you wear it? How do you eat it? How do you dance to it? Right. And I don't know if someone wants to start us up with that.
Well, I guess I briefly would say that I think it's an expression of the author, right? It's an expression of your own authenticity, right? It's an expression of the thing that comes out of you that is deeply, deeply, innately yours, right? Your story. And so I would say that I feel most strongly that it is the original source. It is the originating voice that makes a Latinx story or a Latino story of that kind of a story. I was trained and mentored by Maria Irene Fornes, who would probably bristle at this moment with us, I have to say, who would say, anybody can write anybody's story, right? And I most certainly do. But those stories that I write about everybody else are really Chicano stories. They originate, they're in the Chicano soul, right? So, you know, I was thinking right now when Karen was talking about the multiplicity of characters, because I was thinking that I was also raised in a household where we only spoke Spanish, right? And that in some ways I am, I have a kind of Mexican intellect, but my tongue is American, right?
Oh, wow.
Somewhere in that mix, the Chicano shoots out, right? But it shoots out truly in that Chicano soul, right? So I think it really, for me, is about who is this artist that is creating this work, right? I love it when people say, well, you know, you wrote a play that has no Latinos in it. And I think, oh, wow, that's interesting. Because even when I write a play outside of my own culture, it feels very much like a Chicano play, right? So I wrote a British play, right? I wrote a British comedy, and it's totally Chicano.
I love that.
I mean, I have a question for the other two gentlemen. I mean, when I write, I'm every single character. I mean, I write like an actor, like I don't write like a director. So I'm like, no mames. Oh, what do you mean by that? You know, whatever it is. And so I think that the idea that, I mean, and when people ask you, who's your favorite character or who are you in this play? I'm like, but I'm all of these people. Like, you know, they're just multiplicities of them. And so, yes, I, like Luis, also have plays that are not, I have some plays that are not inhabited by Latino characters. One is set in France and, you know, the pre-revolutionary France with Voltaire and all of that. But the playfulness and the idea of breaking rules and all of that comes from this idea of growing up in Mexico. I had never played an organized game in my life until I moved to the United States. Like every game in recess was imaginary and volcanoes and people falling down and us, you know, whatever it was. And then I moved to the United States and then we would play kickball. And I was like, what? Like what? Okay. I mean, it was fun, but I've never played. I mean, the rules we all made up ourselves, the kids. But this idea that somebody else had made rules, I had never done that till I was 10. So I think my playwriting shows that kind of influence. And so I think we're all the characters all the time. And I agree with Luis. It depends who is writing this, because you could give 10 people from different places the same subject to talk about, and what we would write about would be so different depending on our experience.
I've loved history. I studied history, you know, in college, and that's where I tend to go first. I go to places that I don't know anything about. To me, art making for me has been about really sort of digging the past and looking at all sort of the broken pieces of my culture and learning about it and resurrecting those pieces and exploring them, right? And so to me, as Luis talks about, you know, that Chicano soul, for me, it's about going back to my parents who were immigrants from Mexico, and what they brought were pieces of their culture to the United States, right? And so their Mexico was my Mexico here in the United States, in the rancho where we grew up and that kind of thing. And so those pieces are still with me. They pass those traditions on, but as I've grown as a storyteller and intrigued to find out, well, how do these things fit here with me, you know? And so that's been I feel when I go back to that landscape, I feel like Dracula in a way, being able to sort of rest in the soil of my family.
I love that.
And you know, Latin America is also made up of immigrants. Like my grandfather, his parents were Lebanese immigrants, and it was a great scandal when they were leaving the Ottomans and they got a boat and they went to Mexico because that was the Americas. And the great scandal was that he married a mestizo Mexican woman, and you know, and so I mean, there's Italians in Argentina. I mean, there is the other part of this discussion is that the Americas were not just the United States, and this is something, a lot of, Latin Americans who are from Latin America will say the Americas were this large swath of 2 continents that happened there. And so there's just, someone from Uruguay will have a very different story than someone from Mexico to a place, but unless we all, we cross this border and we all become immigrants. And then it's this big swath that kind of, part of the CARNE y ARENA idea is that this is a unifying force, the idea of crossing a border and coming from being a majority to a minority and what that means in this country.
Yeah. I just wanted to shout out too, because you just inspired me to think that the last of 5-10 years, we've been watching this burgeoning, extraordinary, gigantic Canadian Latinx community emerged, right? And led by really amazing artists, including like Carmen Aguirre, the Chilean Canadian, right? And you're watching a different kind of immigration story emerge, and I love that because we're not talking about borders in the same way anymore.
Yeah,
right.
And the Americas really are expanded truly in a way that they help us sort of dream this whole idea forward. Right? It's a kind of borderless future that we're talking about. And the more we kind of connect with the Canadians, the more I feel like I start to understand this idea that we are just one big America, right? The Americas, and that's exciting. It's exciting not to see yourself in any, I think it's like also a writing idea too, not to create a border or a wall within myself, and I was thinking about that Ursula Le Guin quote where she says, the worst walls are not the ones you encounter, but the ones you make within yourself, right? And I think that's so true. I think about this a lot. Have I created the border, right? And what does the border mean to me, right? I grew up in Los Angeles in a kind of, I always thought of it as a kind of borderless city because having a Mexican father who, was so moved when, Karen, when you became a citizen, because my father was undocumented for 47 years. And then finally one day he said, you know what, let's just go get the card. I don't know what 47 years later made him do that. But I will say that was the moment that a border wall was installed in our family, right? Because we always crossed. And then one year he got caught. And that was the year that it was 47 years later. He said, okay, now I have to do this. But we always just crossed. We walked across, we did our shopping in Tijuana. Yeah. And so, this idea, but also, and it's not just a practical idea, it's also a poetic idea, right? Because I think the writing always felt borderless too, right? That the language, the way, I'm very much immersed in Spanglish. I speak Spanish now to my mother, and my mother speaks English now to me. I mean, so something...
Same.
Something has switched, right? But I will say that is an interesting idea to always not have the border, in your writing.
For me, it's always been about studying nature. I love nature. And nature tells us a lot of things. And one of the things that I approached many years ago when I first started writing for Theater for Young Audiences, I think, Karen, this is probably where we might have met maybe a few years later. But I wrote a play called The Highest Heaven, and it was a play about a little boy who is, during the 1930s in the United States, he's repatriated or deported with his family to Mexico and is separated ultimately from his family and has to find a way to come back home, to cross the border. And one of the things that struck me about nature and butterflies in particular, monarch butterflies, is, they migrate to Mexico, to these forests. And it takes 6 generations of these butterflies to leave and then to return. And so it occurred to me, the same thing with whales, there are no borders for animals, for nature. It's something that we put in our own minds. And boy, it really does mess us up a lot because it puts us in the boxes. And but nature breaks away from those boxes. There's no rules there.
Absolutely. I think, like having had a chance to experience, CARNE y ARENA, which I think, describing the experience a little bit with the three of you, and hopefully, you have a chance to experience it at some point, when the tour comes through your cities. I am very struck that like the relationship with the landscape in that experience is it's where you begin, right? The experience of going through that story and realizing that, in this desert landscape, right, that I had no sense of like where on the border, like which side of the border I was on, right, until like the story starts unfolding, and then I realized, oh, this is where I am right now. But like that quality of the earth beneath my bare feet, because as audience members we're invited to take our shoes off and actually have that skin contact with the ground underneath us, was really powerful. And so, I love that what's being called forth is that ancestral experience, right, of like knowing that our ancestors, for many of us, like these were parts of our seasonal journeys back and forth, for 14,000 years, that like this was as natural to us as breathing and seeking shelter and loving the people that we are close to, right? So I love that we've found ourselves to to immigration and to and especially like the fear of deportation, right? Like the kind of constant terror that we're that we know so many of our communities are living under, and so much of the imagery that we've seen over the last 4 years, sure, but certainly the last 60 years, the last 140 years, right? So like one of the podcasts that I listen to is Latino USA by Mariachi. I'm a big fan of the stories that she tells. In a recent episode, she was talking with Adam Goodman, who I believe is a professor of Latin American and Latina studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he recently wrote a book. It's called The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. And in that book, he talks about how, it's almost been as, forgive the facetiousness, as American as apple pie to be identifying and expelling, or like holding back at the borders, an immigrant community, right? So at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the ones to be kept out were the Chinese, right? And certain European populations who at that point were not yet considered white. And then, over the years, like those markers have just changed and changed until all of a sudden we're in this moment today where the communities that we are seeing being held, like as they are trying to seek asylum at the border and being told to wait, are, Central American refugees and Muslim refugees who have, traveled through Latin America. And so like that notion of the border, which is both real and an illusion. And I love how you all are talking about how whether or not it exists in your narrative landscape, right? Like the worlds that you're creating.
Well, one thing is just to go to the American Southwest to understand a sense of your real self. I think about a year that I spent in Tucson, Arizona, and you go out to the American desert, you go to, anywhere in the American Southwest, you understand something very deeply about land and about connection and about, something that we don't talk a lot about in writing, or at least I don't, because I'm in the academy. We talk a lot about craft and technique and point of view and passion, but what about spirit? That's where I'm working from, right? A spiritual sense of writing. That is the place I'm writing from. I'm writing from the many generations under my feet. I'm writing about all the ancestors that I invite into the room every time I write, right? My father is just around the corner, right? And there's Irene, and there's a lot of people in the room with me when I'm writing. It's a communal idea, a community idea, right? That is something that I think is intricately linked to us as Latinx or as a Chicano writer, is the notion that there is a beautiful ancient thread that goes through many generations, but also through the living and the dead. And I hope that doesn't sound too hokey pokey, because for me, it feels like the place that I am writing from, right? So when we start to talk about immigration or migration, or the issue of the undocumented right now, I really have to think about it over many, many generations. I have to think about it in a way that feels like it's not just in the living right now, but it's also in those who have passed before us. Yeah, I'm just very inspired by this. I'm thinking about the poet Yosimar Reyes, the undocumented poet from San Jose, who is doing an incredible amount of writing. But he has a Yossi book club where you read books by undocumented writers, and they're extraordinary, right? And for the first time this year, there's an undocumented Mexican writer who's nominated for, is it the American Book Award, the National Book Award?
Oh, really?
Which is really, yeah, it's really fantastic. I'm going to look it up as we talk, but it's really fantastic. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Great.
But don't wait for me.
Well, I think what you're talking about, Luis, is that, there's two things, and this is what I talk to my playwriting students about all the time. There's the part of the two things you have to develop, and one is craft, right? Know how to write a play, how to deliver it, But the other thing that's uniquely yours that nobody else can do is voice. And I think Luis just brought up what is part of what makes his voice so delicious and so universal and also so epic is the idea of bringing up all his ancestors. And José Cruz González just did the same thing with bringing up history and monarch, right? And this is what flavors all the different plays that they write and populate. And, I've always been so in the beginning when the idea of diversity or diversifying the stages, it was kind of always put up like a favor to the brown and Black communities. Like, we're going to, do this. And I was like, no, you don't understand. Your audiences are going to really like to hear these different stories. And the idea that it's not just, the right, healthy thing to do. It's also the smart and joyful and also encompassing. We all win when we get access to these different points of view and see something different. And so I love it that Luis and José bring in all of because I don't get to meet them. I get to meet everybody and their family every time I see one of their plays. And it's part of the in talking about, there's a lot of parts of our past and a lot of parts of our people that are trauma. There are, because we have to overcome a lot of odds. And when a presidential candidate throws off his campaign by saying that people from your country are rapists and bad people, like that is the first thing that is uttered from his mouth. You better believe that that's going to change the framework in what we're living in. But at the same time, we can explore what it means to, walk barefoot over the sand, or what it means to be scared of deportation, but also what the joy is in eating both a tamal and a hamburger, right? You know what I mean? And so I think not all of us don't want to be siphoned into one kind of story, because everyone here contains multitudes, and understanding where we came from is just part of the story and part of the trajectory.
I think for me, one of the things that I love about storytelling, is oftentimes, first of all, studying about the subject that I want to learn about. And that takes me into talking to many, many people. I love interviewing people. And it's something that I learned through Cornerstone, where you meet people, you talk to them, but out of that experience, one of the most beautiful things is how there in community-based work, you're doing this with the community, for them, with them, by them. And that is something that has changed me profoundly, and how I approach my work today. We're working, Quetzal Flores and myself are working now on a new musical for Denver. And our working title it's just a working title, but Landscapers, Maids, Cooks, and Basketball.
Oh my God.
And we have interviewed, looking at this question of, what is it to be a working person in America right now? And if you happen to be Latinx, right? Pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And so one of the things that we have done is we've gone to interview folks who are doing civil rights work in Texas with the the children that have been in cages, to talking to healers from the community, or community vendors in Los Angeles having organized, who are undocumented, to talking to graphic designers, these young hip women who organized a zine called, the group is called Santa Sucia. Poets, they're artists, they're just amazing, out of Texas, who started this little zine for their community, and then it blew up with artists from around the United States as well as Latin America. And so you know, this has been an education for myself and for Quetzal, learning about some of the communities in the Southwest where, because of generations of being the Native communities being their rituals being taken away and stopped, that the Lakota community came and helped them to restore, use their rituals so that they could find, these practices that had been denied. And so to me, this idea of healing in the art is so important, not only for myself as an artist, but also the people that I'm engaged with and the communities that I'm trying to tell, because there is so much trauma in our communities, and how do you help them to see themselves, to celebrate themselves, but also for those who aren't from that community to go, wow, I didn't know about this. This is so beautiful. Find that beauty that oftentimes is not depicted in our sort of mainstream world.
Absolutely. I mean, like I've been really, moved, just like watching, some of the comments that are coming across in the chat window, folks who are already tying the things that you have been, saying about, how we grew up with our families around language, or, about, how we define ourselves, and folks sharing in turn that this is really speaking to them. And, and for our live audience, I just want to encourage you to keep up that conversation. And also, if you have questions for our incredible panelists, this is your opportunity. Don't let it slip by. So I want to keep on this conversation, right, where we're starting to talk about the content and the stories that we hope, how they engage with audience, right? Like the things that we are hoping to convey, and to talk about form, right? Because in this particular moment, like this conversation was inspired by, the use of technology and virtual reality technology to allow us to put the audience in the character's shoes, kind of literally and metaphorically, right, in new ways. But really, I mean, we've been doing this, right, for generations as theater makers, some would say for, 2,000 years. And so I'm curious, if you all could peel back the curtain a little bit and talk about your craftsmanship, right, as you think about the stories that you want to tell, right? So like Jose, like the example that you just shared, and the audiences that you want to reach, right? Both for the folks who hopefully will see themselves, and folks who might say, that may not be me, but I recognize this feeling, right? And how that plays out with genre, right? Because when we talk about Latinx theater, sometimes the question of, well, is it all about magical realism? Is it all about, having it be, fun and frothy and lively, over the top, like a telenovela? Are we telling stories that are just, tragic, right? And also the ways in which, like some of you and many of our colleagues are also now in conversation, right, with other theatrical canons. So I'm thinking of, Tanya Saracho using Chekhov's A Cherry Orchard to tell a story about, generational, land ownership in the border in a different way, right? And Luis, just want to say, your Greek trilogy, is, I think, often, held up as an example of how we enter into dialogue as Latinx artists, right, with other artists, who had come before us. So when you think about how each of you is compelled to merge, your voice, your perspective, your lived experience, the story that you want to tell, the character you want to introduce us to, and then the form that it takes. How do you navigate that part of the process for yourselves? Have you surprised yourselves sometimes with what you end up with?
I'm looking at Karen because I'm thinking of Native Gardens, and I'm wondering, did that, like, my question has always been, what couple started this journey?
Yes.
That was a dinner party and someone describing a story, and I was like, oh, that's not the play. And then everyone kept coming up with different stories, and I kept thinking, oh, how absurd. How many fights are just so absurd? Like they're primal and they're poetic and people feel very strongly, but they really are. And almost every single fight comes down to property and culture in some way. It doesn't, almost if you look at wars, etc., it comes down to these very basic things and people feeling wronged and people actually almost devouring the enjoyment of being wrong. Like they'd rather, they'd kind of rather keep, there is a need for drama in all of us all the time. So yeah, that was a surprise. I had no idea Native Gardens was going to be a comedy. I thought it was going to be a more, serious exploration about. And then I realized how it's also what happens at the time. I mean, nothing happens in a vacuum. It's about what where you think people will listen. And if you're like telling a story, are people going to disarm themselves and listen? And what are the motives for that? So I just used Bertolt Brecht in two of my plays. And one of them is a crazy, over-the-top, subversive comedy called Destiny of Desire, done by an ensemble where they push things in and they give quotes and they stop the action to remind you that telenovelas may be crazy, but they're not crazier than real life in any way. And the other one was a very, very somber, serious topic called The Copper Children, what was just done at OSF, which is about this real life story about that echoes the idea of children being taken away at the border, but it's using Irish children instead of Mexican children. And the Irish children are given to Mexican minors because they were Catholic. And it became one of the biggest court cases in the nation. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was called the case of the century. We know nothing about it. And that was using the same mechanics of Destiny of Desire, but in a very somber kind of more, and none of them were realistic. All of them, the ensemble was working. But if I was going to it was two different ways of dealing with two different kinds of trauma. One was the one where Latinos are described as spicy, and all our work is described as telenovela, and people are dismissive of our work. So I was like, screw that. I'm going to write the best telenovela ever, so no other play gets compared with that. And the other one is, how do we deal with this trauma of children getting separated, of systemic racism? And I guess for me, if we're dealing with trauma, it can never just be to entertain. It has to be to illuminate and then hopefully move people to action in some way. And I think that's where people feel exploited, is where you feel that people are like, ooh, look at this terrible thing that happened to people. But if you don't give the play or the playwright, and I do put this on our shoulders, doesn't give an avenue in the theater of what to do with that information in a way that is positive, then it just becomes trauma porn. And so that's something that I'm really interested in exploring, is how to make people understand the injustices that have happened, but also give people the tools to kind of fight those injustices.
I want to talk about tools because to me, it's in terms of this craftsmanship thing, I've been experimenting for many, many years, just different ways of using tools as for storytelling. And, from puppetry to music theater to dance to multimedia to different types of technology, it's always fascinated me to try to understand them and use those tools in storytelling. And it's exciting to go, I can pull from this, I can pull from that. And I love doing that because it can then change sort of the size of what you're trying to tell on stage in scale.
I love that. I mean, I think I'm going to say that I'm always thinking about a larger sense of humanity. I'm trying to lift the language a little bit. I'm trying to elevate it, you know? And I think the reason I'm doing that is I think there's a big difference between need and want. I want to write a lot of plays. I want to write a lot of plays, but I need to only write one, right? And so what happens in community, as Jose so beautifully stated, in community, the community tells you what the play is you need to write. And so, you know, you either accept the challenge or not. For me, these Greeks have been so interesting because they all came from very specific community stories. So, you know, the Electricidad is about a young woman in Tucson that I met who was incarcerated. So, you know, the connection between the ancient text and a modern story 1,000 years later, and that was still going on, was like, right? I don't want to. I need to tell this story. I need to make us understand that there's a deeper, larger humanity, a larger world that we all belong to, you know? Oedipus feels like I was writing about the American prison system because all of a sudden I'm reading about the recidivism rate, the return to prison rate in our country. In our state of California is ridiculous. More than half of all young men are going to go back to a state prison more than once in their lifetime. Something is deeply wrong with the system because it's, of course, a business, right? And so just as you start to look at that, and I was thinking that the last one, the Mojada, it was really about trying to write about the undocumented, not because I'd gone to a conference in Chicago where Senator Dick Durbin was speaking, and he said the problem with comprehensive immigration reform is that every time I'm in Washington, nobody wants to talk about people. They want to talk about numbers. And he goes, and the minute you talk about numbers, it instills fear into hate, right? That the numbers start to look a certain way to people. You're going to take something away from me. He goes, we just need to talk about the one family, the one undocumented family, right? And for me, it was like, let me just tell you one story about one undocumented woman and the journey, the true journey that she took.
Yeah.
And then hopefully we can all enter, not as Mexicans or as Chicanos, we enter in our larger humanity. We enter in a bigger world. And just because I don't want to forget, this is the book. Can you see it? I'm so bad.
Oh, yes.
The undocumented, yeah. Buy this book. It's extraordinary. So, you know, I just think, how do we do that? How do we, you know, I had an experience last semester where I had a student who was very smart and noticed my syllabi for text analysis was only people of color for an undergrad course. And she says, I'm really, really worried. She wrote me a little note. I'm really, really worried that you have no Shakespeare in here and you have no Arthur Miller and you have no Tennessee Williams. And I don't feel like I'm going to get the entire experience, or I'm going to get the best experience of what theater is in America. And I said, I promise you, after having for years sat through Shakespeare, that you are going to understand a deeper, bigger, larger humanity. You are going to understand your own generation through these stories. So if you can take the dive, I promise you, I've been doing that dive for over 30 years in the American theater, of going to see white plays by white artists. I promise you that you're going to get a deeper, maybe even more insightful humanity, because you're going to now understand world theater. Because we belong in the world, right? We're borderless people. So, you know, I thought this was really, really interesting. And this is the thing that gets me most excited about writing. How am I writing for somebody in Romania right now? How am I writing for somebody who's going to experience me in another part of the world? So it's not that I'm not writing for my own people. I'm always writing for myself. And I love what Karen is saying about, and Jose is saying about craft. You know, it is passion, and it's, you know, it's craft, it's technique, but it's also this deep down, deep desire to want to tell a story, a very simple story about something that you believe very strongly in the moment. And I know that we have a humongous responsibility to tell that story. I want to have less responsibility in understanding how you're going to perceive that story. Does that make sense? I want to scare you. I want to enthrall you. I want you to laugh, but I also want you to understand the deep, deep wound that lives inside of this country. We're in a trauma moment in this country, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't want to. I don't need to, right? And if you can't sit through that, I think you should not sit through it, because I understand that too. But, lately in the last, 2 years of my academic life, I have a number of students saying, I can't show up this week because I'm going to be triggered by this play. And I said, well, you haven't read the play. Yeah, but I know what the play is about. But I know what the play is about. Yeah, but you haven't experienced this play.
Yeah.
You haven't experienced me as a human being.
Yeah.
And the more you understand me and my complexity and my complication, the more we understand something deeper about our own humanity. I am you, right? And you are me. Well, and we are each other.
The best review I ever got for anything that I'd ever written was at the Denver Center after we were doing Just Like Us, which, as you know, is the real story of an undocumented youth in Denver, written by Helen Thorpe and set against the landscape of a police officer that gets murdered by an undocumented man, and what that happens to all of these, how this cornucopia happens in a little life. And I was in the bathroom speaking to the custodians. There were the ladies there that were cleaning up, and they had worked at the Denver Center for a long time, and this is the first time they'd gone to see the play. And what they said to me is like, you don't understand how many more people are saying hello to us in the bathroom after seeing that play. And I was like, isn't that funny? They had to see someone like you on stage be human, and to see you being human off stage, the ladies brought that up. They're like, you don't understand. After this play, people reach out and ask us how we're doing, and it was a very simple little thing. And I was both devastated, but also very moved by the weirdness of that you can walk by people who are serving you or cleaning up for you and not really acknowledge them. But if you see their humanity on stage, suddenly you see their humanity off stage. And it's the one time where that idea actually proved itself to be true.
That's amazing. So I just want to note that, we've had a viewer who's dropped in a question in the chat, which I think is actually, what we're talking about right now. Thank you, Melissa. How does activism play into your writing? How often do you consider the impact your play might have on audiences today and in the future? Thank you for that. Because I think this speaks to something that, that I'm often thinking about, of like this notion of moving hearts and minds, right? And how that sometimes lives in the tension of, when we do tell stories of trauma, right? As I think, somebody already named, of, potentially, unintentionally telling the story that some of us exist to suffer, right? That our existence is suffering, right? So, so how does activism play out in your writing? And I think some of you are already speaking to that, right?
I think all my work has always been that, for theater for young audiences to the adult work. It's always looking at, for me, at characters, who are often struggling in their personal world, but also in their world in terms of their family and in terms of work, in terms of whatever it is, it's gosh. For example, I'll give you an example. Super Cowgirl and Mighty Miracle, a play for young audiences that I did with Metro Theater many years ago, tells the story of an Afro-Latina child who's, this is during the whole real estate meltdown that we had in 2008, 2009. So I wanted to look at that world and the communities that were losing their homes, and this little girl has to come and live with her African-American grandmother. And her father is Latino, and she doesn't get along with the father. And the father has to leave this child with the grandmother while he goes to another city to find work. And so this is based upon somebody that I'd heard about here in this area, and began to explore, well, what does it mean to be these two halves of me with this grandmother? And all along comes along a little homeless dog, because there were so many dogs that were, abandoned when people left their homes. And suddenly you have this, new family coming together. And so, I'm not going to wave a flag and say, hey, I'm being, political here. I'm going to tell you a story, and it's there, but I'm going to try to move you. I'm going to try to stimulate you, and hopefully get to your heart, to hopefully change you.
Yeah, I mean, I came to the theater, from a political family and from a politicized world. I was more involved in politics before I came to art, and my goal has always been like to make art that, changes community, that creates social change. Lots of things have changed since then, but my base has never changed, right? The idea is, how do I use this technique, this craft, this discipline to create change? And change is the constant, right? So change is the spiritual course for me. How do I change every single play? How do I change in every experience? How do I keep changing? That's really it for me. It's very simple. I try to keep it simple because I'm a simple person. But how do I keep changing with everything that I do? Because the change is constant and circular. Politics don't go like this. They go like this.
Absolutely.
I think there's always, you just start writing with a question. I don't think we have any of the answers in any way. I think we're engaging our imagination to ask questions differently, and hopefully the audience can help us find answers. But I think at the base of every good play is an unanswerable question, and that's why we keep writing and we keep attacking it from different ways. And hopefully, when it works, theater is community, but when it really works, it's communion. And I think that's where there's a moment of hope.
Yeah.
When everybody says, oh, we together can make something happen here. And that's the elusive, what we're all looking for that moment of connectivity, community. And when it really works is communion, where we're like, okay, we're all alive in this moment. What can we do to make not just our lives, but your lives better, or how are we improved? And so I enter every play with just questions like, both of these fantastic gentlemen who I've admired for years have taught me through also their inquisitive natures and their adventureness and all of that. I think they're all different ways of just trying, how can I be a better person? How can you help me be a better person? And if I'm exploring to be a better person, will that help you too? Because at the end, we don't have the answers. We certainly don't.
Oh my gosh. Well, folks, I can think of no better way to wrap up this moment in this conversation, because I know that we're going to continue this, for forever and ever and ever, because the questions are endless, right? So, ending on community, on communion, on the unfathomable, questions and the answers that we're always seeking, and, and going right to that heart, right to the reminder that, tú eres mi otro yo. You are the other me, that we have always been connected, even if we have not yet met, right? So Luis, Jose, Karen, thank you so much for the gift of this time. And to all of you in the audience for joining us for this conversation, and hopefully for you watching this in the future, stay in conversation with us. And all that to say, take good care of yourselves and each other, and hopefully we'll see each other in the theater again soon.
Yes.
Much love, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.